Get that poor man out of my VIP seat. People dressed like him belong in economy class, not next to me.
The seat is mine.
Remove him before we miss departure. Remove him. Men like you don't belong up front.
Every passenger in first class was watching when Ethan Walker rose from the seat he had legally purchased, one hand holding his daughter's backpack and the other protecting her trembling fingers. His worn coat, scuffed shoes, and quiet expression had already convinced the crew that he was less important than the wealthy woman now settling comfortably into his place. No one examined the boarding pass she covered beneath her hand. No one questioned why Ethan remained so calm as his name disappeared from the cabin record. As he stepped toward the aircraft door, a small black card briefly slipped from his wallet marked with an emblem the flight attendant almost recognized before it vanished again. Ethan did not protest, threaten, or demand special treatment. He simply studied the crew members' badges and glanced once at the altered passenger screen. Within moments, hurried footsteps approached from the terminal. What devastating mistake had they made by judging this single father too quickly? Ethan Walker entered the first-class cabin of Aurelia Atlantic Airlines, with one hand resting protectively on the shoulder of his 10-year-old daughter, Emma. Nothing about him suggested wealth or influence. His dark brown wool coat had softened at the elbows after years of use. His pale blue shirt was plain and open at the collar, and the leather on his black shoes was worn along the edges. Emma followed closely in a cream-knitted sweater, carrying a small navy backpack against her chest. They were traveling to Seattle for a memorial service honoring Emma's late mother, followed by a school science exhibition the next morning. Ethan had chosen the earliest direct flight so Emma could arrive rested, and he had legally purchased seats 1A and 1B in first class. When they reached the front row, Ethan checked the boarding passes once more, placed Emma beside the aisle in 1B, and helped her secure the backpack beneath the seat. He settled into 1A by the window, fastened his seatbelt, and quietly watched the ground crew moving beyond the glass. Emma opened her sketchbook and began tracing the outline of an airplane wing. For several peaceful minutes, they looked like any father and daughter preparing for a long journey. Then Vanessa Sinclair entered the cabin. Her arrival changed the atmosphere before she spoke a single word. She moved through the aisle in a fitted white designer suit, followed by a nervous assistant carrying an expensive leather case. Several passengers recognized her as the chief executive of Sinclair Global and immediately straightened in their seats. Vanessa barely acknowledged them, her attention fixed on seat 1A. She stopped beside Ethan and looked first at his worn coat, then at his scuffed shoes before turning toward Claire Donovan, the senior flight attendant responsible for first-class service. "Why is this man sitting in my seat?" she asked. Claire glanced at Vanessa's boarding pass and saw that it clearly listed another position farther back in the cabin. She also looked at Ethan's pass, which showed 1A without ambiguity. For one brief moment, the truth was obvious. Then Claire noticed the Sinclair Global logo on Vanessa's assistant's documents and remembered the rumors of a valuable corporate travel agreement. Her professional smile tightened. There may have been a system error, she said, despite knowing there had not been one. Ethan held out his boarding pass. Emma and I were assigned these seats when the reservation was confirmed. Vanessa did not take the pass. She looked at Ethan as though his explanation itself were offensive. "People can print anything at home," she said. "I requested the front seat weeks ago." Ethan remained calm. "Your request does not change the ticket I purchased." Emma stopped drawing and looked up. Claire's expression hardened. Not because Ethan had raised his voice, but because he had contradicted a powerful passenger in front of witnesses. She asked him to step into the aisle so the matter could be resolved without delaying boarding. Ethan refused to leave Emma alone and requested that Claire verify the reservation through the central system. Claire tapped rapidly on her tablet, then angled the screen away from him. Instead of confirming the existing assignment, She announced that the airline needed 1A for an operational accommodation. She offered Ethan a seat in economy near the rear of the aircraft. When he asked about Emma, Claire said the child could remain in 1B while he sat separately, or both could accept whatever seats became available after boarding ended. Emma's fingers tightened around the edge of her sketchbook. Ethan's voice stayed even, but his eyes sharpened. You are proposing to separate a 10-year-old child from her only parent because another passenger prefers our seat. Claire lowered her voice and warned him not to make the situation more difficult. Vanessa gave a dismissive laugh and told Claire that a person who truly belonged in first class would understand discretion. Several passengers turned toward them. One man lifted his phone, pretending to check a message while recording. Another passenger whispered to her companion and glanced at Ethan's coat. Emma noticed every look. Her cheeks flushed and she lowered her head as though she had done something shameful. Ethan leaned toward her and quietly told her to keep breathing. Claire called Robert Kane, the terminal manager, claiming an uncooperative passenger was obstructing departure. Robert arrived within minutes, already irritated by the possibility of a delay. Claire spoke to him first, describing Vanessa as a priority corporate client and Ethan as a passenger refusing a necessary reassignment. Robert did not ask Ethan for his version. He did not properly examine the reservation history or confirm whether the proposed separation of father and child violated procedure. Instead, he glanced at Vanessa's jewelry, recognized her name, and made his decision. He told Ethan that airlines reserved the right to change seats for operational needs and offered him a travel voucher of modest value. Ethan asked Robert to state the operational reason in writing. Robert refused. He warned that airport security would remove Ethan if he continued resisting crew instructions. Vanessa folded her arms and watched with open satisfaction. "This is taking far too long," she said. "Move him before he ruins the flight for everyone." The passenger's attention became heavier than the silence. Emma looked up at her father with wet eyes. "Did we do something wrong?" she whispered. Ethan looked at Claire's silver name badge, then at Robert's identification card. He memorized both names. He studied the tablet in Claire's hand and saw that the seat assignment field had changed, though he had never consented to any modification. That detail mattered more to him than the insult. Without showing anger, he removed his paper boarding pass, folded it slowly and precisely, and placed it on the armrest. Then he stood. Vanessa stepped aside just enough to let him pass, her smile thin and triumphant. "Next time," she said loudly, "buy a ticket that matches your place in the world." A few passengers looked uncomfortable, but no one challenged her. Ethan helped Emma put on her backpack and took her hand. As they moved into the aisle, Claire informed the cabin that the seating issue had been resolved. Vanessa lowered herself into 1A and rested her hand over Ethan's folded boarding pass without reading the name printed inside. Emma kept her eyes on the floor while her father led her toward the aircraft door. Ethan did not argue, threaten, or reveal anything about himself. He simply paused beside Claire, looked once at the altered passenger screen, and said that changing a traveler's record without consent was not a seating preference. It was a serious decision. Robert dismissed the warning and ordered him to keep moving. Ethan obeyed, guiding Emma away from the cabin while the passengers watched the plainly dressed single father leave the seat he had legally purchased. Behind them, Vanessa settled comfortably against the headrest, convinced that the aircraft had finally been restored to the order she believed wealth entitled her to command. Ethan and Emma were not taken back into the terminal. Instead, Robert Kane instructed a gate employee to keep them inside the jet bridge while the crew searched for 2 available seats in economy. The aircraft door remained open behind them, and the low mechanical hum of the cabin mixed with the sounds of luggage being shifted overhead. Emma stood close to her father with both hands gripping the straps of her navy backpack. Her face was still red from humiliation, and she avoided looking through the doorway where Vanessa now occupied the window seat that had belonged to Ethan. A gate employee repeatedly checked a handheld device, then quietly told Robert that the remaining economy seats were scattered throughout the cabin. Robert ordered her to keep searching. He seemed more concerned about avoiding another confrontation with Vanessa than about keeping a child beside her father. Ethan remained still near the wall of the jet bridge, watching the employee navigate through different screens. He did not ask for a better seat. He did not demand that Vanessa be removed. His attention stayed on the sequence of changes appearing in the reservation system and on the growing unease in Emma's expression. After several moments, Emma finally looked up at him. "Why didn't you tell them who you are?" she asked softly. The question carried no pride or expectation of privilege. It came from a child trying to understand why her father had allowed strangers to embarrass him when she believed he could have stopped them. Ethan lowered himself slightly so they were at eye level. He placed one hand on her shoulder and glanced toward the aircraft door before answering. "Because if they respect us only after learning that I have power, then they never respected us at all." Emma looked toward the cabin again. "But they made everyone think we were lying." Ethan's expression softened. He told her that truth did not become weaker merely because a room full of people failed to recognize it. What mattered now was not proving that he deserved a particular seat. What mattered was understanding how easily the people responsible for passenger safety had ignored their own rules. Emma did not fully understand, but she recognized the calm certainty in his voice. She stepped closer and held his hand. Ethan looked down at the boarding information displayed on the gate employee's device. He could see enough to know that his original assignment had not simply been replaced for operational purposes. His name had been removed from Seat 1, moved into an unassigned economy status, and marked as though he had voluntarily accepted the change. Emma's seat remained temporarily attached to 1B, creating a record that suggested she would travel separately from him. No one had asked Ethan to sign anything. No one had recorded his refusal. Claire Donovan had not merely taken his chair. She had altered the official passenger record to make her action appear legitimate. Ethan asked the employee whether the update had been processed as a voluntary change. She hesitated and looked at Robert. Robert immediately stepped between Ethan and the screen. He said the internal coding was none of Ethan's concern and repeated that the crew was working to accommodate them. Ethan asked who had authorized the change. Robert said Claire had made the adjustment and that he had approved it as terminal manager. Ethan asked whether either of them had documented the reason for separating a minor child from her only parent. Robert's jaw tightened. He accused Ethan of trying to turn a routine seating change into a legal argument. Ethan did not respond to the insult. Instead, he asked the gate employee not to touch the record again. Robert laughed and said Ethan had no authority to give instructions to airline personnel. At that moment, footsteps approached from the terminal side of the jet bridge. Marcus Bennett, Aurelia Atlantic Airlines Regional Executive Director, was walking toward the aircraft with two operations supervisors. He had been making an unannounced inspection of gate performance before the morning departures, and had been told that one flight was being delayed by a seating dispute. Marcus expected to find an angry passenger or a confused employee. Then he saw Ethan standing beneath the harsh jet bridge, lighting with Emma pressed against his side. Marcus slowed so abruptly that one of the supervisors nearly walked into him. For a second, he seemed unable to reconcile the plainly dressed man in the worn coat with the person he knew from private board meetings and annual strategy sessions. Then his eyes moved to Emma, to Robert's defensive posture, and to the open aircraft door. The color drained from his face. Chairman Walker Marcus said. Robert turned toward him, irritated by the interruption, but the words reached him before he could speak. His expression emptied. The gate employee froze with the device still in her hands. One of the operations supervisors straightened immediately. Marcus stepped forward and addressed Ethan with careful respect. He asked why the chairman of Aurelia Atlantic Airlines was standing outside one of the company's aircraft instead of seated inside it. Robert looked from Marcus to Ethan and then back again, as though waiting for someone to explain that he had misunderstood. Ethan did not answer the question directly. He gestured toward the gate device and asked Marcus whether a first-class passenger's assigned seat could be changed without consent. whether a minor could be separated from a parent without written approval, and whether a terminal manager could authorize the alteration without recording a legitimate operational reason. Marcus's eyes shifted toward Robert. Robert opened his mouth but produced no explanation. Ethan asked whether the original passenger data could still be recovered. Marcus said every change would have been time-stamped and attached to the employee account that made it. Ethan then asked whether the aircraft could legally depart, while the passenger list contained an unauthorized modification. Marcus did not answer immediately. He already knew the implication. Robert finally found his voice and attempted to step closer. He said the situation had been a misunderstanding caused by pressure to keep the flight on schedule. He insisted that Ethan and Emma were about to be reseated and that there was no need to escalate the matter. Ethan looked at him without anger. "I am not asking for my seat back," he said. Robert seemed confused. Ethan continued questioning the process. He asked whether Claire had verified Vanessa's assignment before moving him, whether Robert had reviewed the reservation history before approving the change, and whether either of them had confirmed that the revised cabin record matched the people physically occupying the seats. Robert admitted that he had relied on Claire's summary. Marcus looked toward the aircraft door, and the seriousness of the problem became visible in his expression. Ethan told him to lock the reservation data, immediately preserve every version of the passenger manifest, and prevent anyone from making further changes. He ordered the flight suspended until the entire record could be reviewed. He also instructed Marcus to contact Rachel Monroe, the airline's Director of Legal Affairs and Compliance, and bring her to the gate before any passenger was allowed to depart. Robert stared at Ethan as though the request were an act of personal revenge. He reminded Marcus that a suspension would create delays, missed connections, and significant cost. Ethan answered that an unreliable passenger record was more serious than an inconvenient schedule. Marcus immediately took out his phone and began issuing instructions. One supervisor returned toward the terminal to notify operations control. The other moved to the gate desk and ordered the aircraft release status changed. Robert stood motionless, listening as the flight he had tried to protect from delay was officially placed on hold. Inside the cabin, Claire received a call through the interphone. Her face tightened as she listened. She looked toward Vanessa, who was already impatiently checking her watch. Claire informed the captain that ground operations had suspended departure pending a passenger verification review. The announcement spread confusion through the cabin. Passengers who had watched Ethan being removed assumed the problem had ended. Now the aircraft door remained open, ground personnel began gathering at the entrance, and no one could explain why the boarding system had suddenly been locked. Vanessa demanded to know how long the interruption would last. Claire said she had not been given a time. Vanessa accused the crew of incompetence and reminded Claire that important people had schedules that could not be disrupted by administrative mistakes. Claire tried to reassure her, but the confidence she had displayed while forcing Ethan from his seat was gone. She checked her tablet and discovered that she could no longer access the passenger list. Every attempt returned the same locked status. She looked toward Robert through the open doorway, expecting him to restore control, but he would not meet her eyes. 5 minutes after Ethan had been forced out of seat 1, the cabin announcement system activated. Passengers were informed that the aircraft could not continue boarding or prepare for departure until a mandatory ground review was completed. They were instructed to gather their personal belongings and leave the plane in an orderly manner. A wave of protest moved through first class and then through the rest of the cabin. Some passengers believed there was a mechanical failure. Others whispered about a security threat. Several began recording again. Vanessa refused to stand. She told Claire that she would remain in her seat until someone explained why the entire aircraft was being emptied. Claire, now visibly shaken, repeated that everyone had to leave. Vanessa pointed toward Ethan's folded boarding pass, still lying partly beneath her hand, and complained that the delay had begun only after the troublesome passenger was removed. Claire did not answer. One by one, the passengers moved into the aisle and began filing toward the aircraft door. Vanessa eventually rose, furious and humiliated by being treated like everyone else. She walked out ahead of Claire, followed by the assistant carrying her leather case. The moment she stepped onto the jet bridge, her expression changed. Ethan was no longer standing alone with his daughter. Marcus Bennett stood beside him, speaking in a low and urgent tone. Rachel Monroe had arrived with members of the airline's legal and compliance teams. Additional senior airport managers were gathered nearby, waiting for instructions rather than giving them. Emma still held her father's hand, but the people around Ethan now watched him with unmistakable deference. Robert remained several feet away, pale and silent. As the passengers emerged from the aircraft, their complaints faded into confused murmurs. Those who had laughed at Ethan's worn clothes now studied the executives surrounding him. Claire stepped through the doorway last and saw Marcus turn toward Ethan before addressing him again as Chairman Walker. The words passed through the jet bridge like a sudden drop in pressure. Vanessa stopped in the middle of the walkway. Her eyes moved from Ethan's modest coat to Marcus, Rachel, and the assembled leadership team. For the first time since entering the aircraft, she had nothing to say. Robert Kane moved toward Ethan before the last passengers had fully cleared the jet bridge. His face had lost all color, and the confidence he had shown inside the aircraft had disappeared. He lowered his voice, hoping the surrounding executives would not hear the desperation in it, and said the incident had been a serious misunderstanding. He insisted that he had never intended to disrespect Ethan or Emma and claimed he had acted only to prevent the flight from being delayed. Then, in his panic, he made the admission that exposed everything. "If I had known you were Chairman Walker, I would have handled this completely differently." Ethan looked at him for a long moment while Emma remained beside him, still holding his hand. He did not raise his voice. "That is the problem, Robert. You believe I deserved fair treatment only after you learned my title." Robert tried to correct himself, but Ethan continued. He reminded him that the boarding passes had been valid before Marcus recognized him, that Emma had been a child traveling with her father before anyone knew who he was, and that the rules protecting passengers had not suddenly become more important because the chairman was involved. Robert said he had trusted Claire's explanation and believed the seat had to be reassigned for operational reasons. Ethan asked what operational reason required moving a paying passenger from seat 1A to an unassigned economy position while placing another passenger in the seat without reviewing her ticket. Robert could not answer. He glanced toward Vanessa as if hoping she might defend him, but Vanessa stood with her arms folded, her expression shifting between anger and disbelief. Ethan turned to the gathered passengers and made it clear that the flight had not been stopped because his pride had been wounded. He said the aircraft had been suspended because the official passenger record had been altered without authorization. A seat assignment connected a person's identity to the location recorded for the flight. When that information was changed falsely, the company could no longer trust that the cabin record matched the people actually seated on board. The mistake was not a private insult that could be erased with an apology or a free ticket. It was a failure of procedure, accountability, and safety. Rachel Monroe stood at a portable operations terminal with 2 members of the compliance team, while Marcus Bennett secured the area around the gate. She requested the original reservation file, the current manifest, the employee access history, and every modification made during boarding. Because Ethan had ordered the data locked quickly, the system preserved the sequence of changes. Rachel examined the information carefully before turning the screen so Marcus and Ethan could see it. The original reservation clearly showed Ethan Walker assigned to seat 1A and Emma Walker assigned to seat 1B. Both tickets had been paid, confirmed, and checked at the gate without any warning or irregularity. Vanessa Sinclair's ticket showed a different first-class seat farther back in the cabin. There had been no duplicate booking and no system error. Rachel opened the modification record. Claire Donovan's employee account had removed Ethan from seat 1A only minutes before departure. She had moved him into an unassigned economy status and transferred Vanessa into his original seat. Claire had then selected the code indicating that Ethan had voluntarily accepted the reassignment. No written consent, electronic signature, or recorded confirmation supported that claim. Rachel looked directly at Claire and asked when Ethan had agreed to the change. Claire swallowed and said she believed his decision to stand up and leave the seat had demonstrated acceptance. Rachel reminded her that Ethan had stood only after being threatened with removal by security. Compliance rules did not allow an employee to convert forced obedience into voluntary consent. Claire said she had been under pressure and was trying to keep the cabin calm. Rachel asked why she had ignored the boarding pass in Ethan's hand. Claire answered that Vanessa was a high-value passenger and had told her the front seat had been requested in advance. Rachel pointed to the ticket record showing that the request had never been approved. She then opened the authorization log. Robert's manager account had approved Claire's change less than a minute after it was entered. There was no evidence that Robert had reviewed Ethan's boarding pass, spoken privately with him, checked the reservation history, or investigated the effect of separating Emma from her father. Robert claimed Claire had described Ethan as disruptive and said he believed immediate action was necessary. Ethan asked whether standing quietly beside a legally purchased seat had become disruptive merely because the passenger refused to surrender it to someone wealthier. Robert again had no answer. A young flight attendant named Noah Mitchell had been standing near the edge of the group, visibly uncertain whether to step forward. He had served in the cabin during boarding and had witnessed Claire's first review of the tickets. When Rachel asked whether any crew member had seen the seat map before the alteration, Noah raised his hand. Claire turned sharply toward him, but Marcus told him to speak freely. Noah took out his phone and explained that he had photographed the original seating chart because the cabin tablet briefly stopped responding during boarding. He had intended to use the image only to verify meal requests and passenger names if the system failed again. The photograph was time-stamped before Ethan was removed. It showed Ethan in 1A, Emma in 1B, and Vanessa in her assigned seat. Noah also showed a second image taken after Claire changed the record. The difference was undeniable. Rachel asked whether he had heard any discussion between Vanessa and Claire before the change. Noah hesitated, then admitted that Vanessa had complained about her seat near the galley and told Claire that Sinclair Global would soon be selecting an airline for a major corporate travel agreement. Vanessa had suggested that employees who understood the needs of important clients were often remembered when executive recommendations were made. Claire looked down. Noah said Claire's attitude toward Ethan changed immediately after that conversation. Before it, she had acknowledged that Ethan's boarding pass was valid. After it, she began describing the assignment as a system error. Vanessa stepped forward and accused Noah of twisting a harmless remark. She said she had never directly ordered Claire to falsify a record and had only expected the level of service appropriate for someone bringing significant business to the airline. Rachel responded that the investigation would determine whether Vanessa's pressure contributed to the violation, but her status did not erase what had happened. Several passengers who had been watching from the gate area began speaking among themselves. One of them, the man who had recorded the confrontation from first class, approached Marcus and offered his video. Rachel reviewed it on his phone while the others gathered close enough to hear the audio. The recording showed Ethan seated calmly beside Emma Vanessa standing over him and Claire refusing to examine the evidence he offered. It captured Vanessa ridiculing Ethan's clothing, questioning whether someone like him belonged in first class, and demanding that the crew remove him. It also captured Emma asking whether she and her father had done something wrong. The final portion showed Vanessa settling into one, while Ethan's folded boarding pass remained beneath her hand. The passengers who had laughed or silently watched now avoided Ethan's eyes. Vanessa did not apologize. Instead, she accused Ethan of using his position to create a public spectacle and damage her reputation over a minor seating dispute. She reminded him that Sinclair Global was considering a corporate agreement worth millions to Aurelia Atlantic Airlines. If he allowed her to be humiliated in front of the passengers, she warned that the agreement would disappear and the airline's board would hear exactly why. Ethan's expression did not change. He said a contract that depended on employees ignoring safety procedures and degrading ordinary passengers was not an opportunity the airline should accept. Vanessa told him he was being emotional because his daughter had witnessed the incident. Ethan answered that Emma's presence made the failure more painful, but not more serious. The record would have been false whether the displaced passenger was the chairman, a mechanic, a teacher, or someone traveling for the first time. He refused to trade passenger dignity and procedural integrity for Sinclair Global's money. Rachel informed Vanessa that her premium customer privileges were being suspended while the airline reviewed her involvement in the incident. Vanessa attempted to walk back toward the gate, but airport security stepped into her path. Marcus told her she would not be allowed to reboard the aircraft or enter the restricted departure area. She demanded that Claire confirm she had never ordered an illegal change. Claire remained silent. Vanessa looked around at the passengers who had watched her take Ethan's seat and realized that no one was willing to defend her. Security escorted her away from the boarding area, while her assistant followed with the leather case. Her white suit and diamond jewelry no longer commanded admiration. They only made her easy to recognize as the woman from the recording spreading among the waiting passengers. Rachel then turned to Claire. She formally revoked Claire's authority to work the flight and ordered her employee access suspended pending a full investigation. Claire began to cry and said she had spent years building her career. Ethan did not respond with cruelty. He told her that experience made the decision worse, not better, because she had known the rules and ignored them to impress someone powerful. Claire handed over her tablet and identification badge before being escorted from the gate by a supervisor. Robert remained nearby, hoping his apology and long service might protect him. Rachel continued reviewing the compliance archive and discovered that the morning's incident was not isolated. Several earlier complaints had accused terminal employees of favoring wealthy or publicly known passengers during seat disputes. Some involved families who had been separated. Passengers pressured into unwanted downgrades, and complaints closed without proper review. Each file had passed through Robert's office. In several cases, he had marked the reports resolved, even though no interviews or supporting documents had been recorded. Robert said the complaints had lacked evidence and that he had been trying to keep minor service issues from overwhelming the department. Rachel replied that he had not reduced the problems. He had hidden them. Marcus formally suspended Robert from all terminal duties and ordered his system access disabled. Robert looked at Ethan and asked for another chance to explain. Ethan said the investigation would give him that chance, but he would no longer control the records or the employees who might testify. Robert surrendered his identification card. Around them, the balance of power had completely changed. Ethan remained in the same worn coat and scuffed shoes, but no one saw him as insignificant now. Vanessa had been removed. Claire had lost control of the cabin, and Robert had been stripped of authority. Yet Ethan showed no satisfaction. He looked down at Emma, whose expression held relief mixed with sadness, and understood that exposing the truth was only the beginning. The company still had to prove that fairness would not disappear again the next time the passenger being mistreated had no title capable of frightening the people responsible. Ethan stood before the displaced passengers in the gate lounge, while Emma remained quietly beside him, her hand resting inside his. He did not hide behind Marcus Bennett, Rachel Monroe, or the authority of his position. Instead, he personally apologized for the delay and explained that every passenger had been required to leave the aircraft because the official manifest could no longer be trusted after unauthorized changes had been made. He made it clear that the inconvenience was real, that missed connections and disrupted plans mattered, and that the airline would not excuse its failure simply because the truth had eventually been discovered. Aurelia Atlantic Airlines immediately provided meals access to the private waiting lounge replacement flights and appropriate compensation for every affected passenger. As the tension began to ease, several people who had watched Ethan's humiliation approached him. The man who had recorded the confrontation apologized for remaining silent while continuing to film. A woman who had laughed quietly admitted that she had judged Ethan by his worn coat before hearing a single fact. Others confessed that they had known something was wrong, but had been afraid of creating trouble for themselves. Ethan accepted their apologies without bitterness, but he did not tell them that silence was harmless. He reminded them that cruelty often gained power not only from the person committing it, but also from the crowd that watched and decided not to interfere. Emma listened closely, understanding that her father was not trying to shame anyone. He wanted them to remember the next person who might stand alone without a title money or influence. The internal investigation moved quickly because the records had been preserved. Robert was dismissed for approving false passenger information, suppressing earlier complaints and using his authority to favor people he considered important. Claire's employment was terminated because she had reassigned Ethan's seat without consent, falsely marked the change as voluntary, and risked separating a child from her parent. Noah, however, was formally recognized for preserving the original seating evidence and for speaking truthfully when doing so could have damaged his career. Ethan recommended him for the airline's leadership training program, explaining that courage and integrity were more valuable than obedience without judgment. Before leaving the terminal, Ethan approved immediate reforms across Aurelia Atlantic Airlines. No employee could remove a passenger from a confirmed seat merely to satisfy someone wealthy, famous, or commercially valuable. Any seating change involving a child required clear approval from the child's guardian. Complaints involving discrimination would be transferred to an independent department rather than handled by local managers who might benefit from hiding them. Employees were given the right to refuse instructions that violated procedure without fear of punishment, and senior executives would be required to travel anonymously at regular intervals so they could experience the service that ordinary passengers actually received. When the replacement aircraft was ready, Marcus arranged for Ethan and Emma to receive seats 1A and 1B again. Before boarding, Ethan noticed a tired mother supporting a young son whose leg was injured. The boy struggled to move through the crowd and looked exhausted by the delay. Ethan quietly handed their first-class seats to them. Marcus offered to arrange another premium section, but Ethan declined. He and Emma boarded with the remaining passengers and chose 2 ordinary seats farther back in the cabin. Once they were settled, Emma asked why he had given away the seats after fighting so hard to prove they were theirs. Ethan explained that he had never fought for the comfort of a chair. He had fought because the rules had been broken, and because people had been treated as though dignity depended on wealth. Justice did not mean taking back everything that had been stolen from them. It meant making certain the same thing could not be done to someone else. Emma looked toward the front of the aircraft, where the injured boy was now resting beside his mother, then leaned against Ethan's shoulder. As the plane lifted toward Seattle, the events of the morning no longer felt like a story about a powerful chairman revealing himself. They became a lesson about the kind of power that truly mattered. Real authority was not the ability to remove someone from a seat, silence an employee, or demand obedience. It was the responsibility to stand beside those who could not protect themselves and to change the system so they would never have to stand alone again.